Welcome everyone to today's virtual meeting focused on education issues with regard to the pandemic. This is our last week in our series of meetings, so we welcome you and thank you for joining us today. We are going to be doing an update on the state revenue and state education budgets and federal aid. We had discussed this with you about 6 weeks ago or so, and now we know a whole lot more about what the state revenue forecasts look like and how that may potentially impact education budgets. And we also have a few updates for you on federal education issues as well. As a reminder, the protocol for today's virtual meeting is that you join us by video rather than a phone. And we'd also love for you to turn on your videos so we can see your face and it feels a little bit more like an in-person meeting. Please be sure to add your full name to your tile, and you can do that by clicking on the 3 dots in your upper right-hand corner. Please add your name and your state also, or your organization if you would. This helps us keep track of who's joining us today and also helps to make sure we have a secure setting. Be sure to mute your audio unless you are speaking, and feel free to virtually raise your hand if you would like to be recognized today during our discussion. You can also type your questions into the chat box, and we'll be sure that the speakers have an opportunity to answer those questions. Please do not share your screen and under any circumstances. And just a reminder that this meeting is recorded and that the archive and slides will be publicly made available on NCSL's YouTube channel as well as our website. And the link is listed right down there for our website. So as we get started, we're going to do a little bit of chatter in the chat box. We'd love to know from you, first of all, which state you're from, and what is your state's anticipated revenue decline as a result of the pandemic? Any information you have for us is helpful for us as NCSL staff to track that information, and we'd also love for you to share it with others who are participating in the meeting. We also would love for you, we're going to do a little quiz here to see if you can identify the capital that's listed in that picture. So if you know which Capitol building that is, please also type that into the chat box as well. And just a hint, it is a Western state. So while you're doing that, I am going to get started and introduce today's speakers. We have 4 amazing experts, an embarrassment of riches really, of the expertise at NCSL. And in a partnership with the Learning Policy Institute on state and federal budget issues. Erica McKellar is in our fiscal affairs program, and she keeps track of state budgets and state revenue. Dan Thatcher is in our education program, and he is our education finance expert. Mike Griffith is at the Learning Policy Institute, and Mike is also an education finance expert. And Austin Reed is in NCSL's Washington, D.C. office, and he is our federal education expert. So just a review of the agenda for today. First of all, we'll hear from Erica. She's going to speak to the current state of state budgets and what we know about the revenue shortfalls. We will take a few questions and then we'll get into the impact on education budgets. Again, take a few questions. And then we'll end our discussion with an update on federal education aid. And again, take a few questions from you. And then at the end of the meeting, I'll preview a really exciting opportunity that we have on Friday for you. This is more of a professional development session for you to learn more about evidence-informed policymaking and how important that is and how you can hone your skills in that area. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we are going to ask Erica to join us.
Thank you, Michelle. All right. Okay. Well, thank you guys for having me. As Michelle mentioned, I'm Erica McKellar, and I'm in our Fiscal Affairs program here at NCSL. If you were on a previous Education Committee call that I talked about state budgets on, I apologize if some of this information is repetitive, but I hope that there is some new information that will be useful for you as well. So one of the questions that we've been getting a lot is how the situation that we're in now compares to the Great Recession in terms of revenue declines. And I think for many of us, the Great Recession felt really sudden, but compared to the Great Recession, we've really kind of jumped off a cliff here. Revenue declines 2 or 3 years during the Great Recession, and for all intents and purposes, a lot of revenue just stopped for a couple of months for states. And of course, spending continues. So, we really saw some immediate effects and some immediate large shortfalls that, could precipitate some drastic cuts by states. Every state is getting hit hard by the pandemic and the economic crisis that we're facing. States that rely heavily on income taxes, the unemployment rate has affected their revenues. Many states delayed their tax filings to July 15th, which has pushed funding they would have had in fiscal year 2020 into fiscal year 2021. So that's creating some cash flow issues for those states. So they're seeing a significant impact. States that rely heavily on sales taxes are obviously seeing an immediate impact. A lot of retail was essentially shut down for a couple of months. And the things that folks were buying, like groceries, are largely tax exempt in many states. Online sales taxes have helped. States have been able to collect those, so that has been helpful. And there's some evidence that there's some pent-up demand for goods and services as states start to reopen their economies. So there's some hope that sales tax figures might be a little better than anticipated, but certainly still going to be significantly impacted. The states that are probably going to be the hardest hit and face some prolonged challenges, states that are reliant on severance taxes like Wyoming, North Dakota, New Mexico are facing a lot of challenges right now. Oil prices have rebounded some as people start to plan their summer road trips and people go back to work, but they're still lower than many states had budgeted for, creating some challenges there. States that rely heavily on tourism, like Hawaii and Nevada, I think could face some prolonged challenges. We don't yet know what the pent-up demand for travel will be, and if folks will flock back to casinos for gambling revenues in Nevada. So states that rely on tourism could see some prolonged challenges as states start to reopen their economies. So we at NCSL are working to track state revenue projections. We're tracking this on our website, and this map is accompanied by a table on our website where you can see both fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021 revenue projection declines. As you can see, there's a lot of red here. Unofficially, we're kind of hearing that states are preparing for a 15 to 25%, to have 15 to 25% less revenue than they had anticipated, which is a huge staggering number and could lead to significant cuts. As you go to our website, each of these is linked to the individual report where we pulled this information from. And I would encourage you to kind of dig into those individually if you want to do some comparisons, because they don't all use the same assumptions and they may not be comparing to the same time period of revenue estimates. So use some caution when you're making comparisons with this data. But I do think it provides a nice overall look at the drastic fiscal picture that states are facing. And we're working to update this now. It should be updated in the next couple of days since we've seen some more revenue estimates come out here in June. So I encourage you to go to our website and take a look at that. As we know, demand for social service programs also increases during times of economic downturns. So, we see more folks eligible for Medicaid. The unemployment rate was 13.3% in May, and we don't know when those jobs will return. So state budgets really get squeezed at both ends during times of economic downturns. So another question that we're getting a lot right now is how states are going to balance their budgets. There's a lot of unknowns still out there right now. We're still seeing a lot of states right now just sort of directing agencies to prepare for cuts. You know, Georgia asked agencies to prepare for 14% cuts. Utah asked agencies to provide some different scenarios. And so far, we've seen those kind of work in increments. Georgia ended up asking agencies to cut by 11% instead of 14% after some revised estimates. Utah last week was able to balance their budget without sort of these drastic scenarios, but we're still seeing states ask agencies to kind of prepare for some various revenue scenarios. The states kind of are still unsure about what the revenue picture is going to look like. Spending freezes for the remainder of fiscal year 2020 have been implemented in a lot of states. We're also seeing states implement furloughs for state workers. And then I think down the road is when we'll start to see, right now we're seeing a lot of across the board cuts. And I think down the road is when we'll start to see some more targeted cuts. And we know from past recessions, higher education tends to be one of those areas that can be cut first. And so we may see that happen again, depending on how the economy rebounds. Other ways that states may balance their budgets, revenue increases are another way they can. I don't think we'll see a lot of that this year for a couple of reasons. One, it tends not to be the first way that states balance their budget during times of economic downturns. But two, it's also an election year. So we tend not to see a lot of revenue increases during election years. But I think this is a tool that states could reach for next year if these trends continue. Other methods that we've seen states use during past recessions, broadening the tax base has been one way that states have closed revenue shortfalls, implementing temporary tax increases, temporary taxes on high income earners, and of course, tapping state rainy day funds. There are some other options states might reach for this time around that weren't really available during the last recession. There are a lot of new products on the market that states can tax, like e-cigarettes and potentially marijuana. There are some digital taxes states could impose. I know Maryland had proposed a tax on digital advertising earlier. So, if state revenues don't rebound as quickly as we hope, then I think we could see states reaching for some tools from the Great Recession and maybe some new tools with some of the new technology and things that are on the market. One other, consequence of everything we've seen is that the budget process itself has really been interrupted. And I apologize, I forgot to pull a new map for this. We updated this on Monday, so there's a couple states that have since passed budgets that are not reflected here. That's available on our website, and I can get that to Michelle also after this. But states are really still uncertain about their revenue. So we've seen more states than we typically do pass stopgap measures. Typically when states pass a temporary spending plan, it's because they can't agree on, the House and Senate or the legislature and governor can't agree exactly on what to spend or how much to cut. And this year we're just seeing states pass those just to give themselves more time to get a handle on, what the revenue picture is going to be. We're also seeing a lot of states plan special sessions. They passed maybe base budgets that they now need to go revise. So it's been an interesting time for, budget process as well. And I think we'll see a lot of special sessions as states get a better handle on what the economy is going to look like. A little good news for states is that reserve funds are healthy. We saw states draw down their reserve funds to about 4.8% during the Great Recession. They've rebounded to, above 10% now. We at NCSL, we track rainy day funds, but we typically look at a state's year-end balance to determine its overall fiscal health. So that's a combination of rainy day funds plus any carry forward balances that a state may be holding. So that's what this line here shows. So, the good news is that many states do have some reserves that they can draw on that will hopefully help mitigate some of the cuts they may have to make. More good news, the federal government did pass the CARES Act, which provided $150 billion to state, local, and tribal governments, which is certainly helpful, but unfortunately does also come with some challenges for states. Some states are still struggling with who has the authority to allocate those funds. The uses of the funds are fairly stringent. They must be used for unexpected costs related to COVID-19, and the funds must be spent by the ultimate recipient by December 30th, which, many states are working to get tracking procedures implemented, and working to figure out what the best use of those funds are and what allowable uses are under the current Treasury guidelines. So certainly helpful amount of money, but also comes with some challenges for states. The bottom line is that there is still a lot of uncertainty for state budgets. Every state right now is in some way reopening, but we don't fully know what that will look like yet. We don't know how much pent-up demand there's going to be. We don't know how soon some of the jobs that have been lost will return. We don't know if there will be a second wave that will force states to maybe re-shut down some industries. And maybe the biggest question mark out there, we don't know if there will be more federal aid coming to the states. So, we've seen some states holding off on spending all of that coronavirus relief fund money to see if Congress will allow more flexibility for its uses. And we're also seeing states kind of waiting to see what the federal government will do, if anything, to provide more aid to state and local governments. I think this quote by the California Department of Finance kind of sums up the position that we're all in right now. It's possible the economy could recover more robustly than our economic experts are projecting, but it's also possible all these numbers could be even worse than we're projecting to be now. So, we really don't know what to expect. And so I think states are really in a waiting period and just trying to get a handle on things. We here at NCSL are really trying to track that as it happens. So please visit us on our website where we're tracking this information. My contact information is on the screen, so please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. We're always happy to answer questions and do any research that might be useful for you. So that's all I have, Michelle. If there are any questions or anything else I can provide.
Sure. So if you have a question for Erica, please be sure to either unmute yourself and let us know. Or if you would like to type your question in the chat box, you may do that as well. In the meantime, I do have one question for you, Erica.
Sure.
Typically, I know that things are not typical right now. So I assume that there are some folks who may potentially, or some states who would typically know what the revenue forecasts are by now, and things are just in such a wait and see space right now that we just don't know. And I'm curious if you have a sense or have some sort of a prediction of when states will have a better idea of their revenue.
Yeah, so official forecasts vary greatly by states. Some states will do it every quarter. Some states will only do it at the start of a fiscal year, or the start of a legislative session. We've heard from states that I think everybody's trying to do unofficial estimates, at least I think in June and July, just because the fiscal year does start on July 1st for most states. So many states have tried at the end of May and early start of June to get some preliminary estimates out there that legislatures and governor's offices can work with. But I think we'll see states revising those much more often than we typically do as the summer goes on and we get a better handle on things.
And it looks like Delegate Jared Solomon from Maryland has his hand up. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Erica, for the presentation. I had a question, particularly around the COVID Relief Fund. So being in Maryland, my other day job, I used to work on Capitol Hill, and I followed up with a couple of colleagues who work on appropriations issues, and I read through the Treasury Department's guidance, and we've had some difficulty in getting a straight answer from our governor's office. It seems to me in my reading that coronavirus relief fund is pretty broad. So our state has about $1.3 billion left that hasn't been allocated to local jurisdictions. And I guess, one of the issues I've been working on particularly is childcare, and I know that's been a big issue in a lot of states across the country. It seems to me that our governor would have the authority to take a chunk of that money, a relatively small chunk in the grand scheme of things, and use that, to provide a relief grant or support program to our childcare, providers that are really hard hit and operating at half capacity. And again, in reading the Treasury Department's guidance, it seems like that would be more than allowable. What's your read of the relief fund guidance and how states are able to allocate that money? Because the county I live in, is using its allocation for that purpose, and it seems to me that the state would be able to do the same thing.
Yeah, so the biggest thing that's been stressed to us from the Treasury Department is that allowable expenses have to be somewhat related to COVID-19. So it's really designed to be a temporary way for states to assist with these types of things. I think that would be an allowable expense, to the extent, childcare, places where we're hard hit by the pandemic, you could provide a grant, I think, to childcare facilities.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, don't quote me on that, but that's my current understanding from our conversations with folks, and I'll check back with others. We've also been sort of batting these questions back and forth about what's allowable, what's not. So I'll get some input from others too, and see if they think differently. I'll let you know.
I have a question. Based on your reading of the Treasury guidelines, to what degree would they be applicable in terms of shoring up funds for state education systems? So I know a number of states, for example, have revised their plans to increase teacher salaries. Is that something that, by your reading, could potentially be justified? Since many teachers aren't, since they face disruptions due to COVID?
My understanding of the coronavirus relief funds in particular is that they would not be able to use for teacher pay raises. A lot of the education uses for coronavirus relief funds were stressed as sort of, distance learning, to the extent that states had unexpected costs related to that. I know there were some other funds provided by the CARES Act that I'm sure Michelle and Dan can speak in depth to, that potentially could be used for that. I'm not sure about the restrictions on those other funds.
Austin, did you have anything that you might want to add to that?
Yeah, regards to teacher salary, so the way that this, from a state level, you could potentially use the governor's education relief fund or emergency relief fund. You could also use potentially the state agency set aside from the education stabilization fund and CARES. Mostly though, the main source of potential salary increases for teachers, or using CARES funds for teacher salaries, would come in the district portion of the education stabilization fund. There's no supplanting provision on those funds, and so districts have pretty wide flexibility for how they use those funds, so they could use those to compensate for staff salaries. And from what we've seen from the department, there's not a tremendous amount of oversight that's going to be exercised there. So there is some flexibility within the education stabilization fund to use those monies for teacher salaries. We're still in the stage where that money is just getting to districts and even to state agencies. So we haven't necessarily seen how those funds are being used, but that's, I think, a broad consensus that those funds could be used for teacher salaries.
Any other questions before we move on? Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump right in. Okay, well, let's go ahead and invite Dan Thatcher and Mike Griffith to give us an update on how these revenue shortfalls may potentially impact education budgets.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Erica, too. It's always interesting to hear from you, Erica, and we rely so much on your work and the work at the Fiscal Affairs Program on tracking state education budgets, and your work is very reliable, and yeah, it's something that I'd bank a lot of money on the money that on the information you provide, because I know it's really accurate. So I'm going to just try to share my screen to the slideshow that I have, and hopefully this is going to go well. And hopefully you can see a picture of a map, and someone let me know if not. So this is the same information, the same map essentially that Erica provided earlier, but I wanted to, for my own purposes, I put it into my own way of analyzing some of this data to keep track for myself of the education budgets. And it's just showing me the same information, but we know that states are really facing an unprecedented budget challenges, but the question is how will those challenges impact K through 12 education? And that's what we're trying to figure out and tease out right now. So we can get kind of an idea by looking at what happened in the Great Recession when state budgets dropped, what happened to K through 12 budgets. So what you're looking at right here, these bars reflect the percent of the total expenditures on K through 12 education out of state funds. And so this is an aggregation of state funds from bonds and federal funds, other state funds, and the general fund. And in fiscal year 2008, states peaked out at about 22%. And you know, these numbers can change too. NCSL tracks these numbers as well. These are numbers from NASBO that I have because they kind of tracked throughout the Great Recession. So about 22% of all of these expenditures out of these funds, 20% spent on K through 12 education. And as we moved into the Great Recession, that figure dropped below 20% in fiscal year 2012 and has stayed below 20% since the Great Recession. So one of the takeaways from this is that when states were trying to manage their budgets and both on the drop and decline in revenue, and then on the expenditure side, the increases that were required on social safety net, cash funds, cash assistance, along with the expansion of Medicaid, there were multiple pressures on state budgets, and K through 12 actually as a share of total spending on state level actually declined a little bit. And I don't know what yet, it's too early to tell whether the same kind of pattern will happen moving over the next couple of fiscal years. But the lines you see at the bottom are year-over-year changes. And the first dark blue line is just actual total spending at the state level year-over-year. And in fiscal year 12 is when we saw the sharpest year-over-year decline. People call that the fiscal cliff, when the federal stimulus at that time dried up, and there was a 7.8% reduction across the country in total spending at the state on K through 12 education out of funds, state funds. And then the dotted lines are year-over-year percent changes in that share of the state budget. So from 22% to 21%, what was that change? So moving on though, it's interesting that when we look at all the revenue that did come in for K through 12 education, it was buoyed through the Great Recession, through the federal stimulus, and through an augmentation of spending at the local level. So yes, with this line, the chart you're seeing, the line chart with the orange circle, that's showing the percent change in spending from the peak in 2008. And in 2010, that's when we saw the sharpest decline from its peak in state revenue at negative 8.3%. But again, some of these drops in state revenue were buoyed by increases in spending at the local level. And we've talked about this before in previous conversations, that when that does happen, it's the school districts that augment their own revenue, do so through a tax increase or a mill increase, and the communities that don't have that wherewithal did not. And so it exacerbated interdistrict inequities during the Great Recession. And now we're trying to get a handle on how this is going to look moving forward. And we're, as Erica mentioned, information's trickling in. We have some really good resources, and one I want to highlight is this database that the NCSL has put together on all the legislation addressing COVID, the emergency funds, health responses, and this is a chart that breaks down what the focus of the legislation has been. In fiscal affairs, fiscal bills, you can see really is the majority of the work of legislatures lately. But education is on there. And there's links to this that you can access later, and you can dig into these bills and sort through them by whether they're pending or enacted or whatnot. But this is another one where we just dig specifically into that share of education bills. And again, we have links to this. And what we're looking at are the states where there have been enactments on education legislation. And for pre-K to 12 appropriation and budget and spending bills, there's been 30 bills enacted so far in 21 states. And of these enactments, a large majority of them are fund transfers. As Erica mentioned, that the end of year cash balances and rainy day funds both are fairly robust compared to this time during the Great Recession. And so we're seeing a lot of different transfers out of different funds into the education and trust fund or the general fund to support K through 12. So, and Erica also brought up Utah, that they were able to maintain a slight increase in their base unit of funding for K through 12 education in the legislation enacted or passed last week. We are seeing some attempts by legislatures to somewhat hold education harmless moving forward. So we'll keep an eye on that, and we're digging through these bills to see exactly how they fit into the larger state budget picture. Finally, there's some excellent resources that both of those bill trackers that I mentioned, and we just have a new page on education finance in the time of COVID-19, and we'll have links to other resources, particularly those data visualizations that I put up earlier. We'll also link to some of the interesting documents that are being produced by you, legislators, and especially legislative staff. So while there's this, we are tracking the bills that are being introduced and acted upon related to COVID and education budgets. There's a tremendous amount of really good work being done by legislative staff right now, and that's not being tracked so well. So I'm going to try to track one of those pieces of work. And one really interesting document I want to highlight, and I'll post on that page, is this and our friends from Utah will maybe work on this. But this is, as was mentioned, that Utah has projections to make 2% cuts, 5% cuts, and 10% cuts. And this is a document that would show line by line what would be cut at 2%, then at 5%, and then 10%. But it gives a really good indication of what is the thinking behind how education may be treated when faced with really stark cuts. And what are the programs, and what are the whole value of these compared to other programs in education. So I'm going to put that up on this website and as a resource, and other resources that you have as a legislative staff that you think would be helpful for your colleagues, please send them to me, and I'd like to put those up as well on the website. At this moment, I would like to now turn it over to Mike Griffith, and I'm going to pull up his PowerPoint presentation. One second, please. Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Dan. And thanks, Erica. I mean, between Dan and Erica, we learned an awful lot about what's happening with state budgets and how it's impacting education. I want to talk a little bit today about what we're seeing at LPI, some of these kind of issues that we're running into that aren't, uncommon. We ran into some of them before during the Great Recession, and talk about maybe some opportunities here for some changes. I would also like to apologize for my mullet that I have going, which is the first time I've had one of these since a horrible life decision I made in the 80s. And hopefully I'll be getting a haircut soon. But Dan, if we can go to the first slide, the next slide, I should say. Great. So, Dan talked part about this, but I'd like to bring it up again. The last downturn lasted 5 years. We didn't hit bottom until we were about midway through that 5-year period. The reason being, right, there were reserve funds that states had built up. There were one-time budget maneuvers that states took advantage of. And there was the federal dollars. Between all of those, they buoyed us through the first about 2.5 years in most states of the recession, and then we started to hit bottom at a certain point. What we know from that time period, from all the cuts that were made to education, that it impacted student learning. There's some good studies out there that showed that all students were impacted in one way or the other with learning, but specifically students from low income and minority communities suffered the most. And part of that, and Dan touched on it, is the fact that these places are more, low wealth areas in this country are more reliant in general on state funding. Wealthier communities are more reliant on local funding. The difference can be pretty stark. And you can see in some school districts in this country, they receive, wealthier areas may receive 10% or less of their funding from state funds, but they in low wealth areas can receive 80, 90% of their funding from state funding. So huge difference. And the fact that state funding is based off of sales and income tax, which fluctuates, especially during a recession, versus the higher wealth communities that are reliant on stable property tax revenue. So Dan, if we can go to the next. And that's what I just talked about. What we saw then, and again, Dan touched on it, is the separation between high wealth and low wealth areas in this country in spending on a per pupil basis. This is the same thing that we actually saw during the recession of the early 80s and the one of the early 90s, was this separation between the haves and the have-nots, between low wealth and high wealth areas. And again, that disproportionately impacts low income students and minority students with the funding. Unfortunately, unless we kind of address that now during this recession, we could see the same thing happening. So, this is something to think about when you're talking about your funding, about cutting it and reducing it in such a way that doesn't disproportionately impact students who are from low income families or minority communities. Dan, if you could go to the next slide. This was talked about too, but just kind of something that people have said, and I understand this, well, schools should be okay, right? Because the feds provided the CARES Act funding, and the CARES Act money should take care of these cuts that they're making and reduction in revenue. And it's been helpful, but it's only less than 2% of education revenue in the 50 states of DC, coming in at less than $300 per student. So again, helpful, but it's not going to close the gap. To put this in comparison to the Relief Act that was put in 2009 during the Great Recession, it is only 1/5 the size of the federal package during the Relief Act. So big difference in responses now and back, 11 years ago during the Great Recession. Dan, if we could go to the next, great. So, when you're thinking about this, thinking about these cuts, thinking about these issues, these are some big sort of things to think about. One of them is, will your school districts have sufficient funding to open up in the fall? That we're talking right about budget cuts right now, but we also know there are increased costs necessary to open schools safely in the fall. Will your districts be able to do that? Some districts have said, we cannot currently afford to open schools up in the fall if you're going to provide us with cuts and we have these increased costs. The increased cost, we're still trying to get a handle on. We've got an estimating tool if you'd like to take a look at it on our website. We are also working with other groups and ASBO, the American Association of School Business Officials, and the School Boards Association have put out a set of numbers, and what they've said is it's about $500 per kid, an additional cost to open up schools safely come the fall. So you can take a look at that, thinking, do your schools have that extra $500? Can they afford to do this? Can your formula be adjusted if your students move to online learning? And what I mean by that is, do your student count mechanisms allow you to have kids learn online? In some states, it didn't really come as an issue at the end of the school year. The counting periods were over for funding purposes, but it will make a difference. So if you're in a state like Colorado that has a single count day, in the way the rules work now, the student has to be in person on that count day. How are you going to work that out? How are you going to allow that to be adjustable in case some or all of the students are being taught online? Then next we want you to think about, do your budget revisions allow for equity between districts and student groups? So again, that's that talk about this downturn is going to hit different districts and different groups differently. Thinking about when you're making changes to your budget, how is that going to impact students? And then talking about creating greater flexibility in spending, but make sure that doesn't come at the expense of underserved student populations. And what we saw during the Great Recession was some states provided a great deal of flexibility in spending, which was helpful. Districts appreciated that. But in some of those cases, they made spending flexible on things like summer school, after school reading programs that were meant to be directed at certain student groups who needed additional supports. And those funds then were put into a general fund that you were allowed to spend any way you want, not specifically targeted to low-income kids. So what we would say is take a look and think about creating greater flexibility, but ensuring that those dollars then go to the students who need it the most. Dan, if we can go to the next. So I just want to let you know of some great products that some of my coworkers have put together at the Learning Policy Institute. And one of them is a whole guide about reopening schools and using the examples of what they've done in China, Denmark, Norway, Singapore, and Taiwan, about how they made decisions about social distancing, about bringing kids back into school, some of the different solutions that they found in those countries. And Dan, if you can go to the final slide. And then a recent publication from Linda Darling-Hammond, who has said, this is a fantastic opportunity with this downturn to look at making substantial changes and think about education as a new deal, to make changes that we know have been needed to be made in the system, but this is an opportunity for you to make those. And so if I could just talk about the school funding side of it, talking about, in those states where you have formulas that are antiquated, that aren't working for your kids, take advantage of it and make a change to your formula to ensure that you have a better funding formula. Just don't make cuts, but make structural changes that will benefit all of your kids, especially as we move forward. And if you make these changes now, as money grows into your system, as your budgets start to recover, then you can kind of raise all ships. This isn't we're going to benefit one group of students or one group of school districts over another. This is a situation where you can make wholesale changes, and as the money grows within the system, everybody benefits. And Dan, if you could go to that's it. So I hope, if you have any questions for me now, I'd love to answer them. But if not, if you could go to learningpolicyinstitute.org, you can ask me questions or ask any of my colleagues, and hopefully we can provide you with answers that help you get through these very difficult times.
Thank you, Mike and Dan. So we do have one question in the chat box, and I would remind others to go ahead and put your questions there or raise your hand and I'll call on you as long as I see the hand go up. So schools need $500 per student to open in the fall over the $300 they received in the SRES funding. Does the $500 include after-school programs, breakfast, etc.?
So this is that $500 estimate from the school business officials and the School Boards Association. And really what it included were things like cleaning supplies, um, preparation and training for teachers and staff. It did not include additional breakfast. It did not include after-school programs for students. We did do an estimate, and it's funny, the things we estimated weren't on ASBO's numbers, but we took a look at what are the additional costs for online learning, what are the additional costs for food services, and what are the additional costs for students that didn't get a full end of the year education this year to help them, bolster their education attainment. I think you could take a look at our numbers, combine them with the ASBO numbers, and then you could come up with something as a total cost, because we looked at more structural costs. They looked at more short-term sort of cleaning costs and things you needed to open up. So again, the $300 helps, but it doesn't get us there. And we estimated for about 15% of the students alone who do not have high-speed internet connectivity at home, those students are going to cost $500 a piece to get them connected and set up on high-speed internet. So yeah, it's one of those things. I think we're going to see a lot of different groups talking about these costs, but knowing that there are these additional costs there. And right now, the Federal CARES Act money just doesn't cover that.
Mike, I'm hearing a lot about transportation costs. Do either one of those estimates include the additional transportation costs, since buses can only be about a third filled to capacity?
No, that's a good question. And it's something we're struggling with, and we're trying to figure out a good way to answer that. I've heard a third. I've also heard a seventh. It depends on how you interpret the rules and about where students seat. But some school districts have said, we can only put, if we want to keep 6 feet apart from each kid that is not from the same household, we can only fit about a seventh as many kids into our school buses. If that is the case, then, that isn't a cost thing anymore, because there just aren't enough dollars for that, and there aren't enough buses that exist. It's simply one of these logistics things where I don't know what the answer is. So if you're going to need 7 times the buses, or you're going to need your buses to run 7 times as often, I just don't see how that can work. Now, places have talked about the hybrid system, where half your students will, be in class, physically in class, the other half will be online at home. Something like that might be a little more workable with your transportation system. Then you're only talking about 3 to 1 at that point on the school buses, but it's going to be pushing your transportation system to its limits to be able to do, even think of having that type of system and that kind of distancing on a school bus.
I know in our school district, they overpopulate the buses to begin with. So if you think about what it's supposed to be versus what you may end up doing now, and what the reality was is how many students were on the bus, it's ridiculous. The other thing that I would mention too is, I know in the Denver metro area, some of the school districts are not only talking about a staggered school day schedule for like half the students in the school at any given time, but also staggered start times so that the buses could run more frequently during the day, which seems like it would have to be reality. Okay, it looks like we do have a couple of questions in the chat box. When we're thinking about flexibility, do you recommend that states move money from restricted programs to unrestricted programs? Or do you recommend that states make statutory changes to the programs to allow flexibility?
Oh, I would say those are both good ideas. It's going to depend on the program. It's going to depend on what you're doing. But I, again, would just say, ensure that those dollars and those services go to the kids that need it. If you have, say, an after-school program, you might find out that after school, because of the transportation issue, because of other things, doesn't work, at least for this upcoming year. But offer a one-time waiver that says you can use that extended time however you see fit. So that might be after school for some places, that might be starting the school year early in other places, that might be weekend programs, something like that, but ensure that the intent of that, right, is still carried forward. In other cases, you might look at combining programs. So there are places that have separate summer school and after school, and talk again about combining those just for a period of time, but creating an extended learning time grant and allowing flexibility in decision making. A lot of this is going to depend, and we talked about the busing issue. There are some districts that don't have a lot of busing going on. That isn't an issue for them, and they can have sort of a different way of delivering education than a rural district where 90% of their kids have to be bused. And so allow for that flexibility and those decision making by places. Also allow for the fact that some kids are not going to feel comfortable or even be able to come into school in person until there's a vaccine. And so allow those students to participate in after school programs, in summer school programs or weekend programs, but do that online as opposed to being in person. I think the key word with all of this is flexibility. And the second one I would add is focus. Focus on those kids who need these resources, but allow flexibility for how those resources are delivered.
And the second part of the question is, do you have examples of some states that have provided flexibility in state funding for operations?
And this might be something better for Dan to talk about. Maybe Dan, you've seen this, but right now I haven't seen it within the details of state budgets. I can tell you there were some good examples back, in the last recession. And so you saw states like California and New York and others that consolidated down the number of programs they had that were outside of the primary formula. And in the case of California, they used that as sort of the first step to adopting a brand new school funding formula. It took several years after that, but this idea that there are too many pots of money in some states, and these pots of money can cause confusion, each one with a different reporting period or reporting requirements, different expenditure mandates. And the more we can kind of narrow those down, the better it is and the greater flexibility we're providing for school districts. But Dan, do you know of anyone right now that is that's passed something that you've seen?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything really concrete to share. My mind also immediately went to California and the local control funding formula, which was passed in 2015. Is that right? But still in the throes of the really kind of a long stretch of the Great Recession. It also came on the heels for California of a tax increase to help fund its new local control funding formula. But yeah, and the goal really was to get rid of that sedimentary layers of programs that had been piled on over the years to give districts flexibility and to target those funds to districts where the need is greatest based upon the student population. So, that's something that it's a good question and something that we'll keep our eye out for as we're coming through the legislation and reading through some of these budget bills. And yeah, I think it's a good thing to be cognizant of.
Sorry, had myself muted. Austin, let's hear from you with a little bit of an update on what's going on at the federal level. Are they ready to give more money to the states?
That is the big question. Let me share my screen real quick. Let's see, where am I going here? Like a great closer at the end of a baseball game, I'll try to make quick work of our ninth inning here. I know we're coming up on 4 o'clock. All right. Let's talk CARES Act implementation. So all CARES Act, first the CARES Act was passed 3 months ago. It seems like 3 years ago, but all that money has now been dispersed by the Department of Education and is somewhere, its availability it varies depending on the state and depending on the funding stream. If you want to know the status of all these funds, for example, the K-12 funds, the ESSER funds, you can sometimes check the state education website. But a lot of times the money right now seems to be somewhere between the state agency and the actual districts themselves. Right now, we don't have a great sense across the board as to whether school districts have received those the funds, and if they're using them yet. So there seems to be a bit of a lag right now in terms of whether the funds dedicated for K-12 are actually being used. And I get the sense that districts are probably waiting given that the academic year has passed for most schools to disperse those funds closer to fall. There's also the governor's education relief funds. Those are the GEAR funds. Those monies have all been dispersed. I believe every governor applied for those. The Department of Education has posted both the K-12 and the GEAR fund applications on their website. Those GEAR applications can be somewhat descriptive. Sometimes they're not. There are some states that if you look up your application, you won't get any insight as to how the governor intends to use those funds. I get the sense also that many governors are holding those funds in reserve to see their state fiscal situation. I believe many governors are looking at the governor's education fund as a way to compensate for any revenue declines. And then there's also the higher education funds. Those have all been made available to each institute of higher education as of late April. One thing I did hear this afternoon that I had not heard was that the Department of Education is telling institutions that the portion of funds that the institution is allowed to use for non-student emergency, it's called the institutional use portion, that the Department of Education isn't allowing universities to use those funds to backfill or compensate for any revenue declines, which is a bit unexpected. The sense was that institutional portion could be used pretty flexibly by universities, and it appears that in practice that might not be the case. So we're looking into that. That's something that I just heard about this afternoon and hasn't necessarily been made public. The other thing with CARES that we're paying attention is the maintenance of effort provision. The guidance on this was released on June 5th, and the main thing for you all to know is that the department is saying that they won't open their waiver application process for the maintenance of effort for either fiscal year 20 or fiscal year 21 until after September 2021. So if your state is not able to meet the maintenance of effort requirement for fiscal year 20, you would not be able to apply for a waiver for a year and a half. If your state doesn't think that you'll be able to meet the maintenance of effort requirement for fiscal year 20, and you would want to seek a waiver from the Department of Education, please reach out to me and let me know. We are considering engaging the department on this particular issue, but I've yet to hear a state that doesn't think they'll be able to meet maintenance of effort for fiscal year 20, but very curious if that's the case, because we want to make sure that you would be able to apply for that waiver at your convenience rather than at the department's proposed timeline. The other thing that's probably holding up funds, at least at the district level, is the equitable services interpretation from the department. Given the time constraints, I won't get into that too deeply, but the update there is that if you've been following this, it's expected that the department will release a interim final rule within a week or two that will make their guidance give their guidance the force of law, and so it'll elevate it from guidance to regulation. And essentially this would tell districts that they have to calculate the private school share of funds under CARES based on the total population of students in private schools rather than the low income population. And then to Michelle's question, in terms of the fourth stimulus package, yes, I think there's the expectation that at some point Congress will pass an additional stimulus package. The timeline that is still very uncertain. I think it's still likely after July 20th. Senate GOP has been pretty non-committal on the timeline. I know the Senate really is not actively working on this package. Some things I'm hearing is that there's not necessarily agreement on this year's appropriations process. There's a lot of disagreement on police bills that are holding up this process. And then I think there's also just general questions about how CARES Act funds have been used. We're still seeing questions about how you can use the CRF fund. We're still seeing that states and districts haven't necessarily used their CARES money yet. So I think part of Congress is trying to understand what the state need is going to be, as well as how the funds they've already dispersed are going to be used. Of course, the House did pass their version of the stimulus package about a month ago, provided $500 billion for states. It also provided an additional $100 billion directly for education, in addition to that flexible aid. NCSL has asked for $300 billion in direct flexible aid. We also support broadband deployment and state connectivity. And we've been communicating to Congress just the need for education funding. And just for context, there's other groups out there that have been asking for over or close to $200 billion just for education funding. And so the debate on how much funding will go to states and how much funding will go to education is something that we're closely watching, but I think it's something that's not going to resolve itself for at least another month.
Thank you for that very quick update. Does anyone have questions for Austin? And we would encourage you to reach out to him if you do have questions, or if you have particular feedback or advice for him on messaging around any of these things to Congress or the administration. So I wanted to let you know that let me back up here. Whoops, I went too far. This capital is Idaho. It's actually a very beautiful capital, and recently underneath they expanded and built on a bottom floor. Actually, it's not been that recent. It's probably been at least 10 or 15 years ago, where all of their committee rooms are housed. And it is just a gorgeous capital, and I would encourage anyone to go visit it. So I wanted to leave you with some information about the meeting on Friday. This is actually a professional development opportunity for you. We know that we often hear that policies or programs are evidence-based, but what does that really mean to you? Has this just become more of a buzzword or a meaningful label? Do you feel like you have enough information or even the right information to make decisions on budget or policy? And would it help you to know where to look for credible evidence or what questions you might ask to understand if something is really evidence-based? We have a new evidence-informed policy making center at NCSL, and so the director of our center is going to be joining us on Friday to talk about this and to talk about how it is that you can hone your skills to become a savvy consumer of information so that you can ensure that the decisions that you're making are indeed evidence-based. So we would invite you to join us. It's Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you spending time with us. And if you have any questions for our speakers, please let us know. As always, all this information will be posted on our website, and any additional resources that we have to share will be posted there as well. Thank you, and have a good afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you on Friday.